Welcome to Sleepy History Tales, where forgotten truths, buried secrets, and chilling events come alive in the quiet hours. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Drop your state or country in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because what you're about to hear has never been told in full until today. In the winter of 1847, just outside the haunted town of Salem, Massachusetts, a young woman named Latoya was admitted to Blessed Mercy Infirmary, a religious hospital run by stern Protestant ministers. Her case would spiral into such disturbing territory that the attending physicians burned almost all medical records. Only one doctor kept a personal journal hidden away in his family's attic for over a century. It is that journal, combined with fragments of sealed hospital files, that reveals a case so unnerving, so spiritually and medically unexplainable, that it shook an entire community's belief in the nature of the mind and the soul. The local church authorities insisted the records be permanently sealed. And within just 6 months, 3 of the 7 doctors who treated Latoya left Massachusetts, never practicing medicine again. If you have the courage to peer into the darkest corners of religious history, stay with us. This story is not for everyone, only for those who dare to question what others fear to speak aloud. It began, as these stories often do, with what seemed like a routine hospital admission. The town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, sat like a slumbering guardian 15 miles northwest of Salem. Modest wooden houses lined the frozen streets, and white church steeples rose like sentinels over a population of just under 800. By 1847, Millbrook was fractured between the old Congregationalist families who had founded the settlement in 1692 and the rising wave of Irish Catholic immigrants seeking mill work along the banks of the Mary River. Blessed Mercy Infirmary stood at the very center of this growing religious tension. A 3-story brick building erected in 1834 by Reverend Ezekiel Whitmore, a strict Congregationalist who preached that to heal the body, one must first purify the soul. With 20 beds, it was the largest medical facility between Boston and the New Hampshire border. Its reputation drew patients from all across Essex County. The staff, 7 Harvard-educated Protestant physicians, took pride in blending science and scripture in their daily medical practice. Leading them was Dr. Jonathan Aldridge, just 34 years old, but already a rising star in the field of mental health. He had studied under the famed alienist Dr. Samuel Woodward at Worcester State Hospital. Aldridge was a man of unshakable logic and deep religious faith, believing that divine providence and medical science were not enemies but allies. Where others dismissed mental illness as moral weakness or demonic possession, Aldridge and his team sought new therapeutic approaches driven by observation, documentation, and spiritual understanding. The hospital's routine was rigid. Each day began at 5 a.m. with communal prayer, followed by medical rounds, and ended with evening scripture reading. Regardless of their personal beliefs, all patients were expected to participate in these religious observances. A controversial decision allowed nuns from the nearby Sacred Heart Convent Catholic, but medically trained, to serve as nurses. This sparked heated arguments in Millbrook's Protestant churches, but Dr. Aldridge defended the arrangement. He was obsessive about record keeping. In his private study on the 3rd floor, hundreds of leather-bound journals lined the shelves filled with detailed case histories, not just symptoms and diagnoses, but spiritual reflections and emotional notes. To Aldridge, the soul's condition mattered just as much as the bodies. The winter of 1847 was brutal. Weeks passed without the temperature rising above freezing. Despite the coal-burning furnaces, the hospital remained cold, its hallways drafty, the air a bitter mix of carbolic acid and smoke. Many patients described the building's atmosphere as oppressive, almost cursed. It was into this bleak, frozen world that Latoya arrived, bringing with her a mystery that would defy every assumption held by the medical and religious community. On the morning of January 18th, 1847, a horse-drawn carriage labored through snow-choked roads, pulling up outside Blessed Mercy. Inside sat a young woman who would become the most unsettling patient in the hospital's history. She appeared to be in her early 20s. Dark hair, olive skin. Her features suggested mixed ancestry, a detail that would sadly become a critical factor in a time and place where prejudice ran deep and differences were met with fear, not understanding. Massachusetts, mid-January 1847. 3 days before her arrival at the infirmary, Latoya had been discovered unconscious in a barn owned by a local farmer named Silas Hartwell. The temperature outside hovered well below freezing, yet she wore only a thin cotton dress, no cloak, no boots, no gloves. Despite the cold, she bore no signs of frostbite. No one in Millbrook recognized her. When she regained consciousness, her voice barely more than a whisper, she claimed to remember nothing. Not how she arrived there, nor even where she came from. She carried only 2 items, a small leather pouch containing 7 silver coins and a brass locket, with no inscriptions, no engravings, no clue as to its origin, just smooth polished metal and silence. Dr. Aldridge's initial examination yielded even more questions. Physically, Latoya was in remarkable condition. Her pulse was strong, reflexes sharp, skin unfrozen, unblemished. She was hydrated, well-nourished, and uninjured. No trauma, no exposure, no logical explanation. But it was her behavior that disturbed him most. She would only speak when spoken to directly. And when she did, her answers came with an eerie precision, as if she were reciting something she had practiced 1,000 times. Her gaze lingered too long. Her awareness of her environment bordered on unnatural. When Dr. Aldridge asked for her full name, she replied calmly, Latoya. Nothing more. During the intake interview, the truly bizarre began. When asked about her religious background, her entire demeanor shifted. Her hands trembled. Her breathing became shallow. Then she began to speak in what sounded like Latin, or at least it did to Dr. Aldridge. But it wasn't Latin. Dr. Marcus Brennan, the youngest of the hospital's physicians and a Harvard-trained linguist, was summoned. After listening closely, he concluded, "These aren't Latin constructions," he wrote in his notes. "There's a rhythm, a structure. But the grammar is fractured, hybridized. There may be elements of African or Caribbean dialects, but it's something else entirely. Something older." What chilled him further was Latoya's denial. When asked about the language, she insisted she had spoken only English. That night, the first reports began to come in. Sister Mary Catherine, a nurse from the Sacred Heart Convent, noted that Latoya seemed to anticipate events before they happened. She would sit up in bed just seconds before the night watchman began his rounds. She'd ask for water exactly as the bucket at the well ran dry. And without ever seeing a clock, she would wake moments before the church bells rang, as if tuned to an internal chime no one else could hear. But the nurses weren't the only ones unnerved. Zelina Hitchcock, a 50-year-old patient recovering from pneumonia, claimed that Latoya had spoken to her in her sleep, describing in vivid detail the death of Mrs. Hitchcock's husband 5 years earlier, including things she had never shared with anyone. When questioned, Latoya denied everything. "I never spoke to her," she said. "I don't know her husband." Dr. Aldridge, a man of science and reason, initially dismissed these reports as delirium, the fantasies of weakened minds in a strange environment. But his certainty began to falter on the third night, January 18th, 1847, late evening. The halls of the infirmary lay cloaked in shadow. Dr. Aldridge made his final rounds when he passed Latoya's room and froze. She was sitting upright in bed, her eyes closed. And she was speaking, not moaning, not muttering, speaking clearly with a cadence and authority that echoed through the dimly lit ward. The same unknown language she had used during her intake flowed from her lips, fluent and forceful. As she spoke, every patient in the ward began to stir. Eyes flicked open. Bodies shifted restlessly. Murmurs filled the cold air. One of them, Thomas Brewster, a young man recovering from a leg injury, later recounted something truly haunting. He told Dr. Aldridge that as Latoya spoke, he saw visions, not dreams, not thoughts, but full scenes unspooling inside his mind. It was a jungle, he whispered. Tropical, thick air, firelight, people in masks dancing, chanting. They were performing something, a ritual, something sacred, something forbidden. When Latoya suddenly stopped speaking and opened her eyes, Thomas Brewster, still trembling in his hospital bed, found himself weeping uncontrollably. And he had no idea why. Dr. Aldridge, disturbed by the incident, documented it carefully in his journal. The patient exhibits behaviors that challenge our current definitions of mental illness. She shows no signs of hysteria or melancholia, and yet her presence appears to influence others in ways that defy scientific explanation. I find myself torn between empirical observation and phenomena that hint at a reality beyond comprehension. Over the next few days, the hospital's daily rhythm began to shift subtly but unmistakably around Latoya. Nurses noticed that their duties seemed easier when she was calm. Charts stayed organized. Supplies didn't go missing. Patients required less assistance. The coal furnaces which had struggled to heat the infirmary all winter began to maintain consistent warmth. Even the rat problem, which had plagued the building for years, vanished within her first week. These strange developments did not go unnoticed by Reverend Whitmore, who visited twice weekly to offer spiritual guidance. On January 20th, he spent nearly an hour alone with Latoya in the small hospital chapel. When he emerged, his face was pale, his hands visibly trembling as he gathered his prayer book and coat. When Dr. Aldridge asked what had transpired, the Reverend offered only this: "That young woman possesses knowledge no Christian soul should bear. I fear this is no longer a matter of medicine, but of judgment, God's judgment." His fears, it turned out, were well placed. In the days that followed Reverend Whitmore's encounter, the atmosphere inside Blessed Mercy Infirmary began to change darkly, undeniably. Dr. Aldridge, ever the rationalist, began to notice strange patterns. Patients who had been bedridden for weeks suddenly began to recover, but only after being moved to beds near Latoya's. Others who claimed to feel disturbed by her presence experienced setbacks. their conditions worsening the longer they remained nearby. Dr. Brennan, still obsessed with the unknown language Latoya spoke, began digging deeper. In a dusty back room of the Salem Historical Society, he uncovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was an obscure reference buried in a stack of maritime records. A slave ship, the Esperanza, wrecked off the Massachusetts coast in 1823. Among the survivors, one was described as a young girl, speaking in tongues unknown to Christian ears, possessing knowledge of healing arts that, according to the captain, transcended natural philosophy. The ship's manifest, faded and brittle, listed a girl named Latoya, approximately 4 years old. According to the record, she was placed in the care of a strict Presbyterian family in Peabody, but disappeared 3 years later, leaving behind only a note written in the same incomprehensible language Dr. Brennan had heard in the infirmary. The implications are staggering, Brennan wrote to a colleague at Harvard. If this is the same girl, she would be 28. But the woman in our care doesn't appear older than 22. And how could she have acquired knowledge of African spiritual practices while raised in a rigid Christian household? Dr. Aldridge initially dismissed the theory as coincidence until he brought up the Esperanza during a routine session with Latoya. Her reaction was instant and overwhelming. She began speaking rapidly in the unknown tongue, tears pouring down her face, hands clutching the brass locket she'd been found with. For the first time since her arrival, Latoya volunteered information about her past. She spoke of fragmented memories, a ship tossed in stormy waters, the sound of chains, the stench of death, and voices calling to her in languages she somehow understood, though she could not name them. She remembered being taken to a house where they tried to wash away what I was then, fleeing into the woods to live among those who remembered the old ways. I don't age as others do, she whispered. Time moves differently for those who carry generations within them. I remember being young, and I remember being old. I remember dying, and I remember being born. The line between past and present blurred long ago. Dr. Aldridge recorded these conversations with growing unease. As a man of science, he sought answers in psychiatry, perhaps dissociative trauma, or elaborate delusions formed to cope with abuse. But Latoya's historical knowledge, her uncanny predictions, and her emotional impact on everyone around her defied easy diagnosis. The hospital staff began to divide. Some viewed Latoya as a fascinating subject worthy of close study. Others whispered that she brought something unholy into the Christian institution. Surprisingly, Sister Mary Catherine, whose Catholic training had emphasized spiritual mysteries, found herself leaning toward science. I have witnessed miracles, she told Dr. Aldridge quietly. I've seen the sick healed by prayer. But what I observe in this girl, it feels older than scripture. Not evil, but not wholly good either. It feels ancient, primal. The tension finally broke with an unexpected request. Mrs. Zelina Hitchcock, the pneumonia patient who had once accused Latoya of speaking to her in her sleep, asked to be moved to the bed directly beside her. She doesn't just speak to me, Mrs. Hitchcock explained. She helps me remember the things I thought I had lost forever. The way Samuel used to laugh, the songs he hummed in the garden, the exact words he whispered on our wedding day. She brings them back. Dr. Aldridge reluctantly approved the change. What followed was unprecedented. Other patients began requesting similar arrangements. They spoke of healing dreams, moments of clarity, even sudden recoveries. They described a sense of peace they had never known before. But not all reactions were so serene. Jacob Morrison, a merchant recovering from dysentery, became increasingly disturbed in Latoya's presence. He began having violent nightmares, visions of chains, screaming voices, and unbearable guilt. Dr. Aldridge eventually moved him to another wing, fearing the psychological toll was too great. Before he left, Morrison offered a final chilling statement. "She brings the sins of the past with her," he muttered. "I see things I know I never lived, but I feel them like memories. I see myself doing terrible things. I feel guilt for acts I never committed, and I can't escape it." The conflicting reactions to Latoya's presence soon permeated the entire hospital. Some staff members began avoiding her wing altogether during the off-duty hours, taking alternate hallways, inventing excuses to switch shifts. Others lingered outside her room when they had no reason to be there, quietly drawn to some intangible gravity she seemed to emit. Dr. Aldridge noticed a pattern. Younger staff members, especially those with more secular views, appeared largely unaffected. But older employees, particularly those with deep religious convictions, began displaying signs of unease and mounting anxiety. Their prayers grew longer. Crosses and rosaries began appearing on uniforms and nightstands. The growing unease reached a tipping point when, during his next weekly visit, Reverend Whitmore returned, this time with two other ministers. They were Reverend Isaiah Blackwood from the First Baptist Church and Reverend Cornelius Marsh of the Methodist congregation. Together, they requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldridge, referring to it as a matter of grave spiritual concern. Seated in the hospital's cold, dim chapel, Reverend Whitmore spoke first. His voice barely above a whisper. "We have reason to believe," he said, "that your patient may be engaged in practices that are not merely unchristian, but actively harmful to the souls of others." The other ministers nodded solemnly. They had received letters and verbal accounts from families of patients. Their loved ones, they said, had been speaking of dreams and visions that bore no resemblance to Christian revelation. Instead, the stories were filled with ancient symbols, firelit rituals, and languages not found in scripture. Dr. Aldridge found himself standing at a dangerous crossroads, caught between his Hippocratic duty as a physician and the religious authority that funded his hospital. He could not ignore the minister's concerns. There was no denying the unexplained effects Latoya had on those around her. But he also refused to condemn her. She showed no signs of intent, no acts of manipulation or harm. If anything, she seemed as bewildered by her influence as everyone else. In the end, they reached a fragile compromise, one that would forever alter the course of the investigation. The ministers would be allowed to observe Latoya's interactions with patients, and in return, Dr. Aldridge would be permitted to continue his clinical evaluations without interference. Neither side knew then just how far this agreement would take them into territory neither scripture nor science had ever dared to map. The joint observation period began on February 1st, 1847. Dr. Aldridge and the three ministers established a strict protocol. Every interaction would be monitored. Latoya's responses would be documented, and patients' emotional or physical states tracked before and after. Almost immediately, Reverend Blackwood, a Baptist minister who placed great weight on personal spiritual experience, began to notice what he called synchronicities in her behavior. Latoya would begin speaking in her unknown language precisely at moments when a nearby patient entered emotional crisis, often without ever seeing or hearing them. It was as if she could sense suffering as a physical presence. More curiously, her words, even when unintelligible, had a soothing effect, calming distressed patients who could not possibly understand what she was saying. I must confess, Reverend Blackwood later wrote in his private journal, I have never witnessed such a profound demonstration of what can only be described as spiritual empathy. She appears capable of absorbing the pain of others, transforming it into something less burdensome. If this is a gift from the Almighty, I cannot reconcile it with anything found in Scripture. Meanwhile, Dr. Aldridge took a more structured approach. With Latoya's consent, he conducted controlled meetings between her and select patients, observing from behind a curtain, taking detailed notes on physiological changes, psychological reactions, and any verbal disclosures made during or after contact. What he witnessed defied medical precedent. In one such session, Mr. Jeremiah Couch, a 70-year-old farmer with a chronic cough resistant to treatment, was brought in. Initially skeptical, Couch greeted Latoya with polite indifference. But within minutes, his demeanor shifted. He began to speak not about his symptoms, but about memories long buried. He described his time serving during the War of 1812, recounting events and emotions he had never shared, not even with his wife. As he spoke, his breathing eased. The cough present for years began to subside. By the end of the hour, he was breathing freely for the first time in months. It's as if she drew the poison from my lungs, Couch later told Dr. Aldridge. Not just the sickness, but the memories I've carried for 30 years of friends I lost in the war. I told her things I never told anyone, and saying them out loud made them easier to carry. Even more astonishing than the changes observed in adult patients was Latoya's interaction with young Timothy Wadsworth, a 12-year-old boy, recently admitted after suffering what his parents described as fits of madness. During these episodes, Timothy would speak in unfamiliar voices describing events from Millbrook's history that no one had ever taught him. He spoke of battles of deaths and of long-forgotten names that matched no entries in schoolbooks or sermons. His parents, terrified and convinced their son was possessed, had turned to both medical authorities and spiritual leaders with no success. When Latoya was introduced to Timothy, something extraordinary occurred. The boy, usually agitated and incoherent, suddenly calmed. His eyes cleared, his posture relaxed. And then, without warning, he began to speak fluently in the same unknown language that Latoya used. For nearly an hour, the two appeared to converse in this ancient tongue. Their tone was quiet, but deliberate. Each seemed to understand the other completely. And throughout the exchange, Timothy showed no signs of distress, no confusion, no madness. Dr. Aldridge, observing silently from behind a partition, wrote in his notes, they spoke with an awareness beyond their years, as if drawing from a shared well of memory that predates either of them. The boy described graves in the old cemetery, not found in any record, spoke of families long vanished, of conflicts between settlers and native peoples, and of buried secrets that have never been disclosed publicly. Even more unsettling, Timothy described these things not as historical facts, but as personal memories. When the session ended, Timothy returned to his normal state with no recollection of the conversation. His previous episodes ceased entirely. Within the week, he was discharged from the hospital, healthy, lucid, and speaking only English once more. The ministers immediately declared it an act of divine healing. But Dr. Aldridge, though relieved by the child's recovery, was troubled. He could not reconcile what he had witnessed with any known psychological theory. And then, as if the case weren't already impossible enough, Dr. Brennan returned with yet another discovery from the archives of the Salem Historical Society. There, tucked among the dusty letters of a deceased clergyman named Reverend Josiah Mather Brennan, found a series of correspondences dated 1826. The letters described the Reverend's attempts to civilize a young woman living in the woods outside Millbrook, a woman he called the child of many mothers. She was unlike any person Reverend Mather had ever encountered. She possesses heathen knowledge, he wrote, and speaks in tongues that predate even the Tower of Babel. She claims to remember the pain and suffering of her people, not as stories passed down, but as memories she lived. Her healing abilities draw upon forces that no Christian doctrine can explain. I fear I have encountered something that challenges the very foundation of faith. Mather worked with her for 3 years, convinced that he could bring her to Christ. But his final letter, dated December 1829, revealed a man whose beliefs had been shattered. I can no longer continue. She has shown me truths about human suffering that I was not prepared to see. I have glimpsed something terrible and vast, something no mortal mind should ever comprehend. I pray that God will forgive me, but I can no longer serve as a bridge between her world and ours. When Dr. Brennan shared this with Dr. Aldridge, the implications became impossible to ignore. The timeline aligned perfectly with Latoya's disappearance from her Presbyterian foster home. Could the young woman Mather described, living in the woods with pre-Babel language and ancestral memory, be the same person now residing in the Blessed Mercy Infirmary? If so, it suggested something truly impossible, that Latoya had lived 2 decades, possibly more, unchanged. The hospital's atmosphere, already tense, became electrified. More staff members began reporting strange phenomena, not just around Latoya, but within themselves. Nurse Margaret Thornton confessed that she had begun having vivid historical dreams, not about her own past, but about Millbrook's early days, including specific detailed events surrounding the town's founding that she had never studied or even heard mentioned. Even Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's oldest physician, a man who had long prided himself on practical medicine and stern skepticism, reported something equally unnerving. He said he had begun hearing the voices of patients long dead, some of whom he had treated decades earlier. He did not hear them in dreams or during sleep. He heard them when he passed Latoya's room. I remember conversations I'd forgotten. I remember their faces. But more than that, I feel them, as though their presence lingers inside her. The whispers among the staff had grown louder. Some nurses and aides now refused to enter Latoya's wing, making excuses or switching shifts. Others were drawn to it, claiming they felt sharper, more empathetic, and more attuned to their patients' emotional needs when near her. The hospital, normally a place of routine and quiet discipline, had become divided, almost spiritually so. Dr. Aldrich found himself caught in the widening gulf between those who feared Latoya's presence and those who were in their own way transformed by it. Maintaining scientific neutrality was becoming nearly impossible, and what disturbed him most was himself. Latoya had awakened something within him. "I fear I am losing my scientific detachment," he confided to his journal. "She has stirred memories of my own childhood that I believed lost. She makes me see my patients differently, not as case studies, but as bearers of long-forgotten burdens, of ancestral traumas passed through blood and memory. This insight improves my care, yes, but it also shakes my faith in medicine's limits. What if consciousness is not confined to the brain? What if we carry more than just our own lives inside us?" Then came the moment that changed everything. It was Mrs. Hitchcock, the elderly pneumonia patient who had insisted on moving closer to Latoya, who brought the first real revelation. She requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldrich, certain that she was approaching her final night. Her voice was frail, but her eyes burned with urgency. "Doctor," she whispered, "I need to tell you what she's shown me. It's not just about my Samuel. She's shown me things about this town, about this hospital, things that people have died to keep hidden." Dr. Aldrich immediately arranged for a confidential meeting, inviting Reverend Whitmore to join and offer spiritual support. What Mrs. Hitchcock revealed that night in early February would not only shift the hospital's view of Latoya, it would upend everything they believed about Millbrook. "She doesn't just remember the past," Mrs. Hitchcock said through shallow breaths. "She carries it, like a shadow stitched to her soul. And during our talks, she showed me things that happened before any of us were born." Latoya had spoken of the land itself, not just the town or the hospital, but the soil beneath their feet. According to Mrs. Hitchcock, the Blessed Mercy Infirmary had been built atop a sacred burial ground, once used by the Panook people, an indigenous tribe that held the area as a place of deep spiritual importance. The Panook had performed rituals there to honor the dead, not just their own ancestors, but also the forgotten souls of others who had suffered, enslaved Africans, migrant workers, and outcasts cast aside by early colonial society. "She told me there are bones beneath this hospital, doctor. Not just native bones, but bones of people who died in chains. People who were never given names, never given Christian rites. She said their spirits have been calling out, not for revenge, but for recognition, for someone to remember who they were." Dr. Aldrich felt a chill settle over him, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. He recalled something vague and unsettling from the hospital's earliest archives construction notes from 1834. There had been a brief mention of unusual remains discovered during excavation, bones, artifacts, shallow graves. At the time, the issue had been quietly resolved by Reverend Whitmore himself, who had ordered the remains to be removed discreetly so construction could proceed. No record was kept of where the bones were reburied, or if they were reburied at all. And now, more than a decade later, it appeared that the spirits beneath the foundation had finally found a voice in Latoya. The room was silent. Reverend Whitmore's face had gone pale. At Mrs. Hitchcock's words, a rare crack in the stoic facade he usually maintained. For Dr. Aldrich, it was confirmation of something he had begun to fear, that Latoya's insights were not hallucinations or fantasies, but memories, rooted in truth. "There's more," Mrs. Hitchcock whispered. Her breath came in shallow gasps now, but her voice had never been clearer. She told me about a doctor who worked here in the early years. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, Reverend Blackwood's own father. The name landed like a stone in a still pond. According to Latoya, and now Mrs. Hitchcock, Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had performed unthinkable experiments on patients in the hospital's earliest days. But not just any patients. He used those who couldn't protect themselves, she said. Runaway slaves, captured native people, poor immigrants with no families to ask questions. He was trying to study what he called the primitive mind, and he had kept detailed journals. If Latoya's revelations were accurate, then Blessed Mercy Infirmary had been built literally and morally on top of graves, and its early legacy was one of abuse, pseudoscience, and spiritual desecration masquerading as medicine. Dr. Aldrich felt a rising sickness in his chest. To investigate these claims could mean uncovering the true history of the hospital, but it would also mean risking its future, his career, the trust of the community, perhaps even his own sanity. Still, he had no choice. Over the next several days, he began a quiet search of the hospital's oldest files hidden away in the basement archives, a space that had not been properly inventoried in years. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Buried among mundane medical reports and handwritten ledgers, Aldrich discovered a set of leather-bound journals marked with the initials Dr. N. Blackwood. The contents were chilling. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had indeed conducted unauthorized experiments on vulnerable patients, and his intent had not been to heal, but to control, dismantle, and reshape the minds and bodies of those he deemed inferior. One journal described attempts to chart racial characteristics of pain. Another focused on testing the human threshold for fear and isolation. Most disturbing were his studies involving patients who claimed spiritual abilities or ancestral memory. I have identified several specimens who demonstrate what can only be described as heathen enlightenment. One entry read, primarily of African or native origin, these individuals exhibit sensitivity to stimuli that do not affect Christian patients. By applying stress in controlled conditions, I hope to determine the source of their unnatural faculties and whether these traits can be eliminated through appropriate medical intervention. These weren't just scientific studies. They were acts of cultural and spiritual erasure. Dr. Blackwood had developed a method he termed spiritual realignment, combining sensory deprivation, forced isolation, and verbal reinforcement of Christian doctrine, ensured psychological torture designed to sever patients from their ancestral memory. But it was his final entry that left Dr. Aldrich shaking. Dated November 15, 1838, it read, "The young woman, brought to us from the woods, has proven resistant to all conventional treatment. Her ability to recall memory across generations has only grown stronger, despite our best efforts. I am forced to conclude that she represents a branch of human evolution incompatible with Christian civilization. For the safety of our community, I recommend that she be permanently confined to prevent the spread of her influence." Dr. Aldrich's breath caught in his throat. The young woman from the woods, the year, the defiant memory, the language. There could be no doubt it was Latoya. Everything aligned with Reverend Mather's letters and the timing of her disappearance from the Presbyterian family. At some point, she had been taken to the hospital, subjected to Dr. Blackwood's treatments, and either escaped or survived in silence. Yet the journals revealed one more unsettling truth. Blackwood had failed. His final notes described strange disruptions within the hospital staff members plagued by visions, nightmares, and auditory hallucinations. He wrote of a growing belief among his colleagues that the building itself had been tainted, contaminated by the very spiritual energies he had tried to suppress. There is something in her that cannot be silenced, he wrote. And now, it lives in the walls. Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood had died in December 1838. The official cause, heart failure. But his private journal, hidden for nearly a century, told a far more disturbing story. The boundaries between past and present have begun to blur. One of his final entries read, "I find myself remembering things that happened to my patients as if they were my own experiences. I dream of chains and whips, of children torn from their mother's arms, of rituals spoken in tongues no Christian ear should know. I fear I have not cured her, but become infected by her." What began as a study in control had ended in madness. Dr. Aldrich shared the journals with Reverend Whitmore, and the minister's face went ashen. He admitted he had known about the burial ground, that he had personally approved the relocation of human remains during the hospital's construction. But of Blackwood's experiments, he had known nothing. "We built this place to heal the Reverend," murmured his voice thick with grief. "And we did it over the bones of the broken. If this young woman has carried these wrongs inside her for a decade, then we have a duty before God to set it right." But even as they prepared to confront Latoya, the hospital itself began to change. It started with dreams. Patients across the wards began reporting the same vivid, historical visions, events they had never lived through, moments from long before their births. Nurses and orderlies claimed to hear voices in the walls speaking in languages no one could identify. A strange pressure filled the air as if the building were breathing. Doors opened and closed with no one near them. Temperatures in Latoya's wing began to swing wildly regardless of the freezing weather outside. "Something is awake," Dr. Aldrich wrote in his journal. "Not just a person, but a memory. A collective weight that this building has tried to forget." The crisis reached a boiling point when Reverend Blackwood, the son of Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood, approached Dr. Aldrich with a secret he had held for nearly 30 years. "There's something I need to tell you about my father," he said, voice shaking. "He didn't die of a heart attack. He took his own life." And then came the true confession. Before he died, he told me about her, the girl in the woods. He said she had shown him things about our family, about the people we come from, the chains, the violence, the taking of land that wasn't ours. She made him remember everything, and he couldn't live with it. The impact was shattering. If true, it meant that Latoya's ability to reach into ancestral memory extended not just backward into her own lineage, but into others as well. She wasn't just a relic of forgotten trauma. She was a mirror that showed people not only the suffering they inherited, but the suffering their families had caused. Dr. Aldrich could no longer pretend that this was simply a case of mental illness. It was something older, bigger, something that touched every soul in the building. The staff tried to continue their work, but the unease was growing. Some began to avoid Latoya altogether. Others lingered near her door, pulled by something They couldn't name something that made them feel both seen and unsettled. Even Aldrich, once a man of pure science, was beginning to feel himself changing. She's not just a patient, he wrote one night. She's a living archive of memory, of grief, of guilt, of all the things we pretend history has buried, but that live on in our blood and bones. Then came the final revelation. She carries all of it, Mrs. Hitchcock had said. Not just the pain of her people, but the guilt of ours. And now, she's here so we can feel it too. It was the moment Dr. Aldrich realized Latoya had not come to be healed. She had come so that they might finally confront the truth they had hidden for generations. Now, as winter deepened outside the infirmary walls, Aldrich faced the greatest decision of his life. The hospital stood on stolen land, soaked in the pain of those whose stories had never been told. The weight of memory had awakened. The question that haunted him now was this: if we speak the truth aloud, if we admit what's buried here, will that bring healing, or will it tear everything apart? February 20th, 1847. It was a cold morning. The sky over Millbrook heavy with snow that never quite fell. Inside the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, the air was tenser than it had ever been. Dr. Aldrich had made his decision. He summoned the senior hospital staff, the 3 clergymen, and a carefully selected group of stable patients to gather in the chapel. Once a symbol of piety, now the site of something far more sacred truth. We have spent weeks. Dr. Aldrich began attempting to understand this young woman through the lenses of medicine and doctrine. But I fear we have been asking the wrong questions. It's no longer about how to treat her. It's about learning to listen. The doors opened. Latoya entered. She wore a plain white dress offered by the hospital, but there was nothing plain about the presence she carried. She walked not as a patient, but as a priestess, as witness, as vessel. She stepped to the center of the chapel. I am not one person, she began, her voice low but commanding. I am the keeper of those you've forgotten, the voices that never got to speak, the pain your history books do not name. The room shifted. Literally, witnesses would later claim the air grew colder and warmer at once. A smell of soil and salt hung in the air. Several attendants reported feeling others in the room, with them unseen but unmistakable. This place is not yours alone, Latoya said, her voice now pulsing like a drumbeat. This land was sacred before a single brick was laid. My people, your people, all people who suffered came here to grieve, to remember, to heal. She spoke of the Pennacook who had once honored the dead where the hospital now stood. She spoke of enslaved bodies, buried without names, of spirits forgotten beneath the floors of the foundation of the infirmary, laid atop silence and pain. Dr. Aldrich watched as patients around him straightened, as if unseen weights were finally lifted from their chests. Nurses wept quietly. Doctors who had never believed in ghosts looked into Latoya's eyes and saw generations looking back. Then she turned toward Reverend Blackwood. When your father brought me here in 1838, she said he thought he could sever me from my people. He called it science. But every cut he made added another voice to the song I carry. Her voice didn't tremble. It resonated. You want to know what broke him? It wasn't me. It was you. It was the realization that your bloodline is soaked in pain, that the world he built stood on the backs of the broken, and that I still standing proved he had failed to breathe him. Reverend Blackwood could no longer sit. He rose unsteadily, his hands, trembling eyes, wet with tears that had waited 3 decades to fall. He told me. His voice cracked. He said he saw things he couldn't explain. He thought they were curses, but they were memories. Wounds we tried to ignore. He couldn't carry the weight, but maybe now we can. Silence fell across the chapel like snow. Latoya stood alone but carried many. The time for silence is over, she said. You don't need to believe in spirits, just believe in truth. What was done here echoes still. Until you acknowledge it, it will haunt you, not as ghosts but as sickness, as guilt, as history's shadow crawling across your children's dreams. Outside, the storm finally broke. Snow began to fall, soft, silent, cleansing. Inside the chapel, a single candle flickered, though no one remembered lighting it. What can we do? Reverend Blackwood asked, his voice trembling near breaking. How can we make amends for what's been done? Latoya turned to him. Her expression softened, and for the first time since she had arrived at Blessed Mercy Infirmary, she smiled. Acknowledgement, she said gently, is the first step toward healing. But redemption, true redemption, requires more. The spirits gathered in this place do not seek vengeance. They seek recognition. They seek remembrance. And they seek your promise that such suffering will not be forgotten or repeated. She moved toward the altar where Reverend Whitmore delivered weekly sermons. But today, something extraordinary began to unfold. The chapel stirred. One by one, the patients rose, not in confusion or illness, but with clarity. Not in their own voices, but in voices that had waited generations to be heard. Mrs. Hitchcock, frail with pneumonia, began to speak. A list of names, dozens of them, each spoken with solemn precision. Names of the forgotten, those buried beneath the hospital grounds, without gravestones, without rites, without memory. Young Timothy Wadsworth stood next. He described in uncanny detail the layout of the original Pennock burial ground, including the exact placement of sacred ceremonial objects, artifacts, long since disturbed and forgotten during construction. Other patients followed, their eyes distant, their voices foreign. They spoke of families torn apart by slavery, children who had died in chains, traditions that had been silenced, rituals forbidden by those who feared what they could not understand. Dr. Aldrich stood frozen, notebook in hand, as realization washed over him. This was not a mass delusion. This was not trauma. This was testimony. The dead were speaking through the living. Latoya had opened a threshold, and through it came memory, suffering, and truth. The healing you offer in this building, Latoya said, turning to face the assembled doctors, cannot be whole while it rests on unacknowledged suffering. Every patient who enters these halls, she continued, carries not only their own wounds, but the burdens of their bloodlines. Until you understand that you will only ever treat the surface of their pain. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the hospital's most senior physician, rose on unsteady legs. I've practiced medicine for 40 years, he said quietly. I've seen men recover from wounds that should have ended them. And others perished from ailments I could not explain. He looked at Latoya, eyes brimming. I never understood why some souls seem to carry more pain than their lives could possibly account for. Are you saying that pain was inherited? Latoya nodded. Yes. Healing is not only physical, it is ancestral, generational, and the boundary between past and present is not as firm as your science would have you believe. The dead live within us. Their grief becomes our illness. Their silence becomes our affliction. Their unfinished stories become our inheritance. Sister Mary Catherine stepped forward, her rosary clutched in trembling hands. In my tradition, she said, we believe in the communion of saints, the living and the dead, bound by divine love, speaking across time. What you've described, she paused, voice softening, is not contradiction. It is continuity, not heresy, but depth. Latoya turned toward the nun and nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. You understand? The spirits are not separate from you. They are part of your story, your body, your breath. They live in the blood that remembers. And the room was still. For the first time, the walls of blessed mercy did not feel heavy with grief. They felt awake. Latoya stood surrounded by doctors, clergy, and patients, yet she stood with many. But this connection comes with responsibility, Latoya said. Those who carry ancestral memory, as I do, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting. And we help the dead find peace through remembrance. The atmosphere inside the chapel shifted again. Not with fear, but with something sacred. A hush fell across the room. The sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows seemed brighter. The air itself felt purified. The distant clatter and hum of the hospital faded into an uncanny silence. And just when you thought the horrors of Millbrook were finished, they deepened. If this story is giving you chills, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Tap that like button to support our work and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Now back to our tale. What will happen to you now? Dr. Aldrich asked, though he already suspected the answer. Latoya smiled. My work here is nearly complete. The stories have been told. The acknowledgement has been offered. And the commitment to change has been made. The spirits who waited can begin to rest. But the responsibility now passes to you. From within the folds of her simple white dress, Latoya withdrew the brass locket, the only possession she had carried with her when she arrived. But when she opened it, there was no portrait, no keepsake, only a small pinch of earth. Soil, she said, collected from every sacred site where my people were buried or forgotten. She stepped forward and placed it gently on the chapel altar. This contains the essence of all the places where suffering became wisdom. As long as it remains here in a place of honor, this hospital will remember its true purpose. Not just to heal bodies, but to tend the wounds that span generations. Dr. Aldrich felt tears rolling down his cheeks. At last, he understood. Latoya had never been just a patient with a strange condition. She was a living vessel of human memory, a keeper of grief, of injustice. of forgotten lives, and she had been waiting not to be cured, but to be heard. "Will we see you again?" he asked. Latoya's smile was both sad and hopeful. "You will see me in every patient who carries pain they cannot name, in every family haunted by trauma they never caused, in every place where the past still lingers waiting to be witnessed. The work I do continues through those who are willing to listen." And then something remarkable happened. The patients in the chapel who had served as vessels for ancestral voices began to return to themselves. But this time, they came back changed, not confused, not frightened, but lighter, as if unseen chains had been lifted from their shoulders. Mrs. Hitchcock later described the experience as the most profound spiritual encounter of my life. I didn't just speak for the dead, I felt them. And now I feel connected to Samuel, to the ones we lost, to everyone. Her pneumonia, resistant to every treatment, disappeared completely within days. Young Timothy Wadsworth never suffered another episode, but he retained something else. A heightened sensitivity, a quiet wisdom beyond his years, a gift for calming those who were grieving. It was as if Latoya left a part of herself in him, Dr. Aldrich later wrote. A seed of remembrance, a bridge to the past. But the most profound transformation occurred in Dr. Aldrich himself. What he had witnessed in that chapel shattered the limits of his training. Medicine, he wrote in a letter years later, must treat the soul, not just the symptom. We are not only bodies, but vessels of memory. And healing requires us to face what our ancestors tried to forget. He would go on to pioneer what the modern world now calls holistic medicine treatment that honors the physical, emotional, and ancestral dimensions of suffering. And as for the Blessed Mercy Infirmary, something changed. The air grew lighter, the hallways quieter, dreams grew gentler, the soil beneath the building no longer stirred with unrest. Latoya's locket remained on the altar, a quiet sentinel of remembrance. The building itself seemed to breathe easier, as though a weight that had pressed down for generations had finally been lifted. Patients recovered with unprecedented speed. The staff moved through the halls with quiet purpose. Even the air smelled different, cleaner, freer. The tension that had gripped the hospital for weeks melted into something rare peace. Dr. Aldrich, ever the man of science, spent long hours documenting the events, his notes equal parts case study and confessional. He knew he was recording something extraordinary, a chapter of history that would never make it into textbooks. But the world outside wasn't ready. Within a week of the chapel gathering, whispers turned to accusations. Reverend Whitmore was visited by prominent community leaders, Millbrook's Mayor Harrison Blackwell, representatives from the Massachusetts Medical Society, even members of the Governor's Council. They demanded answers. Patients speaking in unknown languages shared visions, talk of spirits and sacred ground. We cannot allow this hospital to be associated with spiritualist superstition, the mayor declared. Millbrook's reputation must remain one of Christian civility and medical discipline. Dr. Aldrich stood in an impossible place. He had seen what Latoya could do. He had watched patients heal from grief they didn't know they carried. He had felt the building itself change beneath their feet. But to speak the truth would mean opening the doors to chaos, political scandal, legal consequences, public disbelief, especially when families of long-dead patients began asking difficult questions. What happened in the hospital's early years? Why were so many records missing? What did Dr. Nehemiah Blackwood really do behind closed doors? The answer came quietly from Latoya. On the morning of February 28th, 6 weeks to the day since she arrived, she requested a private meeting with Dr. Aldrich. He found her calmly folding the few belongings she had collected. "It's time for me to leave," she said softly. "My work here is done. Staying would only cause trouble for you and for the hospital." Dr. Aldrich was stunned. "You still need care," he said. "You deserve protection, compensation. We owe you." Latoya's eyes held a wisdom that silenced him. "The healing that needed to happen has happened," she said. "The spirits have been acknowledged. The truth has been spoken. Those who were ready have heard it." But forcing the rest to understand before they're ready, that only leads to fear and resistance. And that would undo everything we've accomplished. She handed him a letter addressed to the hospital board. In it, she formally released the institution from all obligations. She asked that her records be sealed, not to bury the truth, but to protect those who weren't ready to face it. She included something else, a plea to honor the burial grounds beneath the hospital, guidelines for integrating spiritual and ancestral understanding into treatment, and a promise that healing didn't end with her departure. "What will you do now?" Aldrich asked, though he already knew the answer. Latoya smiled. "The same thing I've always done. There are other places like this. Other dead waiting to speak. Other communities waiting to remember." No one saw her leave the hospital. There was no carriage waiting, no record of a destination. It was as if she vanished into the very air that had once held the cries of the forgotten. But her presence remained. In time, Blessed Mercy Infirmary would become known for its unusually compassionate care. It attracted doctors and nurses who believed in more than just medicine. Patients came from across the state not just to be cured, but to be heard. Dr. Aldrich's journals, sealed until after his death, would later be credited with inspiring holistic care practices decades ahead of their time. And Latoya, some say she was seen again in Tennessee, in Louisiana, in rural towns up and down the East Coast. Wherever people were haunted by the weight of unspoken grief, wherever the dead needed to speak through the living, someone like her appeared. The gift I carry is not mine alone. It belongs to all who are willing to serve as bridges between worlds. On the morning of March the 1st, 1847, Latoya simply vanished. The night nurse, exhausted from a long shift, had checked on her shortly after midnight. Latoya was asleep, breathing peacefully, her hands folded over her chest, like she was already halfway between worlds. But by dawn, her bed was empty, her few possessions gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no farewell note, no explanation. Only one thing remained: the brass locket still resting on the chapel altar, exactly where she had placed it. A silent, sacred reminder that the work was not yet finished. Dr. Aldrich didn't waste time grieving her departure. Instead, he got to work. He implemented the changes Latoya had suggested, beginning a quiet revolution within the walls of Blessed Mercy Infirmary. New protocols required staff to explore family histories and cultural contexts during intake. Patients were encouraged to talk about generational trauma, what Dr. Aldrich called the invisible inheritance. Healing circles were formed to blend medicine memory and spiritual care, and with Reverend Whitmore's support, they created something lasting. A memorial garden built on the hospital's oldest grounds, a place of stillness and reckoning, where every name spoken in the chapel was etched into stone. At the center stood a modest monument carved with these words: "We remember, we acknowledge, we heal." The results were undeniable. Recovery rates soared. Staff turnover fell. The hospital quietly became known for its extraordinary success with difficult cases, though no one could quite explain why. But the full story, that never made it into the official records. In reports to the Massachusetts Medical Society, Dr. Aldrich described Latoya as a young woman suffering from a dissociative disorder, whose healing inspired others. The chapel gathering was labeled a group therapy experiment, and her influence was credited to the power of peer support and emotional resonance. These polished explanations satisfied the skeptics, but they weren't the truth. Dr. Aldrich kept a second set of records, private journals locked away in his study, filled with names, dreams, visions, and memories that weren't his. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that future generations might be ready to understand the truth, that healing is not only physical, that some pain is inherited, that the dead sometimes speak through the living. The ministers too were changed. Reverend Blackwood spent months researching his family's role in slavery and medical exploitation. Eventually, he established a fund to educate children descended from the people his ancestors had harmed. Reverend Marsh reworked his sermons to address intergenerational sin and the need for spiritual accountability. Reverend Whitmore coined a new term, integrative healing preaching, that medicine without spirit is a house without a foundation. And the patients who had been present in the chapel that night, they never forgot. Mrs. Hitchcock described it as the most profound experience of her life. Her pneumonia disappeared within days, along with the weight she'd carried for decades. Young Timothy Wadsworth, once considered mad, grew into a gifted counselor, with a rare ability to comfort the grieving and sense histories embedded in places others overlooked. It's as if he sees time sideways, his mother once said. Like Latoya left a part of herself inside him. And maybe she did, because although Latoya was never seen again, her presence never truly left Millbrook. Not while the garden remained. Not while the chapel stood. Not while patients whispered stories in their sleep that didn't belong to them, but to someone long gone, waiting to be heard. They began to emerge quietly across the country, people like Latoya, individuals with an unusual sensitivity to pain, not their own, but others. They comforted the grieving, soothed generational wounds, and slowly became informal healers in the shadows of their communities. Some didn't even realize what they were doing. They just knew how to listen, how to ease suffering, how to carry what others couldn't bear. Dr. Aldrich practiced medicine for 3 more decades, but he was never the same man. He became a pioneer of holistic care decades before the term existed, a physician who treated not just broken bodies, but wounded souls. His methods quietly reshaped a generation of young doctors who had trained under him, and slowly, whispers began to surface. Others were seeing women like Latoya, In Ohio and Virginia, in North Carolina, physicians described young women of mixed ancestry, always appearing to be in their 20s, speaking languages no one could place, and unlocking buried truths in those around them. In 1877, 30 years after Latoya's disappearance, Dr. Aldrich received a letter from a colleague in Ohio. Now, she appeared in the early spring. Her presence unsettled the staff but healed the patients. She knew things no one had told her. She disappeared after a storm. The pattern repeated. Dr. Aldrich began to wonder, was this one woman or many sharing the same burden? Were they manifestations of a shared consciousness or a sacred lineage passed through blood and memory? He never found the answer. But in his final journal entry, dated shortly before his death in 1889, he left behind the belief that had defined his life's work. We are not separate souls isolated in time. We are threads in a vast tapestry woven from the lives and deaths of all who came before us. Those like Latoya, he wrote, help us remember what we've chosen to forget, heal what we've learned to ignore, and reconnect us to truths that science cannot yet measure. The brass locket remained on the chapel altar for decades, a silent sentinel guarding memory and meaning. When the Blessed Mercy Infirmary was demolished in 1923 to make room for a modern medical facility, the locket was nowhere to be found. No one had taken it. No one had seen it moved. Some say it returned to the soil, to the sacred ground from which it came. Its purpose fulfilled. Today the hospital is gone. In its place, a quiet park used by families, picnickers, and children chasing the wind. But those with sensitive hearts, those who listen closely, report something else. A stillness, a peace, a presence, as if the land remembers, as if healing is still happening there. The case of Latoya challenges everything we think we know about human consciousness, about inherited memory, about the living connection between the past and the present. Was it spiritual, psychological, something in between? We may never know. But what cannot be denied is the effect she had on the doctors who treated her, on the patients who spoke through her, on the community that had to finally face the truth about its past. Latoya's story reminds us, healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering, from confronting the horrors we tried to bury, from listening to the voices we silenced, from allowing the dead to speak through the living. So, we leave you with this. In a world that tells us to move forward, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is look back, honor what was lost, grieve what was hidden, and carry forward not just the pain, but the wisdom born from it. What do you believe? Can people truly carry ancestral memory? Or are there more conventional explanations for what occurred? Let us know in the comments. And if this story made you shiver, subscribe, like, share it with a friend who loves history's haunted edges. Because here at Sleepy History Tales, we don't just tell ghost stories. We listen when the ghosts speak.